I'm here today with Ben Tanail, and it's a pleasure to be with you again and talking about addiction. We already met quite a few weeks ago or a few months ago as an introduction, and we want to share a bit more about addiction today and see what we share, if that is also helpful to other people. And your personal story, you've dealt with addiction or alcoholism yourself and set up a resource to help people to work through addiction and also the deeper causes that might give rise to addiction. And you set up a resource or a website as well to kind of as a portal so people can find you and work with them or facilitate that process. Remind me the website again, Ben.
Yeah, sure. It's called Drunken Buddha. So it's drunkenbuddha.net is where you
Okay.
can find it, or on Facebook.
Okay, cool. And that's how we first kind of got in touch with each other, as you shared some resources on my website and a little bit on one of the pages you were creating around addiction and I think trauma.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things. I put together a big resource of scientific facts about the relationship between trauma and addiction, but I sort of covered all these different areas. So it's, all kinds of different addiction, from drugs to things like perfectionism and workaholism, and detailing scientific studies.
Right.
And then the other one was this, I put together a big list of, I called it the emotional regulation, emotional sobriety mega toolkit, which is about 115 different techniques, exercises for, breathing, movement, meditation, visualization, writing,
Right.
all kinds of things that can help people to upregulate their system, downregulate, to calm themselves, ground, heal, release, clarify
Right.
some of their beliefs and things like that.
So when we're talking about addiction, and I will share that resource with this video that we're doing with my audience. When we're talking about addiction, we can't just look at addiction itself, where we also have to look at what gives rise to addiction, what kind of emotional patterns are underlying addiction. And yeah, I think there's so much to talk about. Where do we start with that, right?
Yeah, well, maybe I could just share, just without going into the story too much, just 30 seconds on what my own experience was.
Sure.
Because I was an alcoholic. I recognized it from being a teenager, but from when I was about 18, 19, it was in full swing. And then I sort of had to hit the rock bottom about 28, just about 5.5 years ago. And then you get involved in the recovery scene. I was in AA and things like that. And I started meditating, getting involved in the spiritual scene. But all these things they're all still sort of coping mechanisms in a way, both AA and meditation and things like that. There were sort of ways of calming me down and connecting me to others, which is great. And it's super helpful. But eventually I started learning about what was really driving it, because up to that point, I'd been very focused on my behaviors, right? So it's the drinking. And once I stopped drinking, the suffering was still there in my body. Essentially, what was driving the addiction was still there, but I had to stop drinking. But I binge chocolate every day. I think when I first quit, I started smoking. I hate smoking, but I started smoking anyway, and drinking energy drinks and loads of chocolate, coffee and things. But eventually, I discovered sort of the more somatic work and started learning about this stuff. And it's amazing the difference it makes when you actually address the drivers in the body. So you mentioned trauma already, which I suppose we could broadly define here as any kind of unresolved emotional imprint from the past. A stance our body and mind is taking towards the world it's an echo of the past that's coming into the present. It's like, I'm unsafe, there's something to watch out for here. So that manifests as anxiety is on the one end of the spectrum, the kind of fight flight side of things. The anxiety, maybe anger and frustration. On the other side of things, there's the more sort of freeze, shut down, which is things like depression. And these are all what's really driving the addictive behavior, right? We're trying to find ways of coping with these painful states of being, which are sort of chronic, because they're a reflection of our past that's continuously looping into the present moment. And that's where I found the real relief, is essentially what I'm trying to say here, is when I started going into the body, trying to find these parts of myself that were sort of echoing from the past, and giving them what they needed. Then the addictions tend to start falling away by themselves. The behaviors actually take care of themselves if you take care of the more internal work, in my experience.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I often speak about addiction as a symptom of trauma or a form of dissociation. And so we use addiction, be it behavioral addiction or substance addiction, as a way of coping or managing a stress. It's just that addiction over time also becomes a problem in itself when it grows out of proportion, right? So then also the focus becomes addiction of how can I rein that in, or how can I manage that addiction that it doesn't become destructive. But it also creates its own problems, because then you start to fight with the addiction and you might lose focus on what are the underlying causes of addiction. So you can kind of get into a loop where you're all the time, you're addicted, you're trying to overcome addiction because you see that it's a problem. But then you inevitably, if you're not dealing with the addiction, the underlying causes of addiction, you kind of all the time looping, trying to fight with it and then falling back into it when there's a stress coming into your life. Back and forth, back and forth. And you can even see that it kind of hops from one addiction to the other. And you just mentioned it briefly yourself. You might go from alcoholism to binge chocolate eating, or watching too much YouTube, or whatever it is. And I do think that managing has a role, and you have to start there of, okay, how can I give some more containment and boundaries to it? But then at some point, once you generate a bit more energy, you do have to address the underlying causes, which is kind of working with the emotional residue. And what we both agree on is involving the body or the somatic part to kind of address that emotional issues or the emotional residue, emotional traumas.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's really interesting that the coping part, as you say, is absolutely necessary, because I mean, everyone has coping mechanisms. I mean, if you doubt that, you can just live in your bathroom for a week and see how well you do,
Right. I think it's interesting to see it from that perspective, that addiction is a way of coping, because it takes away looking at addiction as a negative thing. And I know it can be very destructive, but I think in some ways, to change our perspective or our mindset around addiction helps us to not make too much of a problem of it. What do you think about?
I ideally, I would encourage people to hold the labels of addict and addiction fairly lightly. They're quite useful because it allows you to sort of zoom in on the problem. If you're drinking way too much and can't stop, you need to focus on that area of your life a little bit. But exactly as you say, you get into these loops of worrying about, I'm an addict, that's what I am at my core, and then it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy sometimes as well. And it has a very negative connotation, as you say. So seeing it as a coping mechanism, I mean, A, it's true, and B, as you say, it reframes it really nicely. And then once that allows you to then often to do more harm reduction as well. If you understand what's going on, it's a coping mechanism, it then becomes perhaps easier to accept lesser addiction. So what I mean by that is moving from drinking every day to eating chocolate every day is probably going to make your life better on the whole, and give you more freedom, even though you're still using a coping mechanism. If you understand what's going on, you can, move down a notch. And there's one more thing to say here, about what you're talking about, is once you've got that freedom, a little bit of energy, a little bit of space, people will often, I think, leave it there. They think that's sort of the end of the road for addiction recovery, is kind of like you sort of, you're sober, you're abstinent from your main substance or behavior or whatever it is, and then you sort of just manage that as best you can for the rest of your life. But I would like to say, as you found out as well, you can take it further, and it's really worthwhile taking it further, in my experience, because the suffering in the core of the body is still there. And if you can start to address some of that, that's what provides the real long-term relief,
right,
that people are looking for in the coping mechanisms, but at a deeper level.
I mean, you've probably seen yourself, as you address the somatic part, then the energy that normally went into addiction starts to lessen, or the importance that you need to give to it. So it's kind of a natural consequence of dealing with the trauma or the emotional residue, that the level or the intensity of addiction starts to go down immediately. And I think that's really interesting to see for yourself, that when you work on these issues, that the addiction just goes down. And I kind of, like in my model of dissociation, you kind of have the shutdown response at the furthest extreme, then addiction and excessive thoughts just below that. And then you kind of have a core or coping emotion which is usually an emotion that you're more comfortable or habitually act out or act in. And then you have your core overwhelming trauma or emotion. And so I look at it at these different layers, and the deeper the layer that you address, or what's built on top of that, starts to just lessen in intensity. And of course you go up and down because you have new life experiences and new things that might trigger you and activate you. But the more you become aware of those patterns of dissociation, and you can hold that larger perspective, you can kind of move through those levels more fluidly. And I think that really helps, again, to make less of a problem of addiction. And yeah, just to see that this is the way of how the mind kind of works as best as it can to deal with excessive emotion, being overwhelmed.
Yeah. Well, it's super helpful to have that kind of framework. I think I saw on your website, I really liked what you put. It was something like the conditions for healing from trauma. It was the sort of somatic awareness, a bit of an intellectual framework, and containment or resource. I think that was it, right?
Right. Yeah, I talk a lot about containment and resilience, and you need to go in. A cognitive framework helps you to kind of have what's the word? Kind of have a roadmap to know how things are connected to each other. And then the somatic work helps you to actually work through the emotional residue. So you need both. If you just work on the release all the time without having a cognitive framework, you go back into build up and release the whole time, because you don't see at what stage you're at and what you're working on. And on the other hand, if you just have a cognitive map, but you don't work on the somatic part, you're not actually resolving the emotional residue and all the kind of dissociation patterns that flow out of that. So you need both to kind of work together. And the containment is kind of the glue in between that. As you move into emotional territory, you have to go in and out continuously to build up enough resilience to stay with what is. Because if you move from addiction into the underlying emotion, say it's anxiety, the moment you're in touch with an anxiety, which you've tried to avoid through addiction, the moment you move back into that, at first it will be very overwhelming. It might start to associate with different memories, and there's more emotion that comes through by that association with different memories. And so you'll most likely get pushed out again back into the dissociation, be it the shutdown or addiction response. And so you have to, through having a cognitive framework, you can kind of go back and forth between those somatic layers and build up enough resilience to stay with what is. And the containment provides the space to actually work on the emotions. If you don't have containment, you might have release, but release is not integration. And so you might just release through shouting or stomping or whatever you might do. But if you don't understand the full picture, you'll just build up again. And that's also an addictive pattern, even if it's emotional, right? You go through release and build up and release and build up.
Yeah, there's I mean, it's interesting that you can, in fact, get addicted to emotions in the sense that your body kind of feels safer or more familiar, perhaps is a better word, in certain states of perhaps of shame or anger. And the build up and release cycles. Yeah, I've noticed that probably in myself a little bit as well as I was doing this work. You have these big catharses of which can be really helpful sometimes.
Totally,
but if you overdo it, you can. I sometimes got stuck in. I noticed myself with repressed anger, for example, getting stuck in a loop of catharsis, and it would keep coming, and I actually had to slow down a little bit and then start integrating it with a little bit more control. So still fully feeling the anger, but not quite in. I was like jumping around the room, just yelling and hitting things. And I, after ages of doing that, I was like, maybe there's something I'm missing here, and just dialed it back a notch, and then that seemed to seem to be really helpful in integrating it. And integrating repressed anger is, yeah, that was transformational for my own addiction. I mean, that was one of the cores. Like this, I think for most people, they'd be absolutely astonished at how much repressed anger is in their system.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it comes back to those layers of dissociation. With a lot of us, we have anger at the core because society doesn't really accept anger. And so, and when we're young, also we're being told not to be angry or throw tantrums, etc. So very often we have some kind of anger at the core, which we haven't been able to express or act out. And then that flows into anxiety because there's that lack of boundaries or not clear boundaries of having been able to say your yes or your no, and that naturally then moves into anxiety. And so anxiety or sadness, but often anxiety kind of stays on the more top layers. And then that further on fuels the addiction or the excessive thoughts of I'm not good enough, or I should have been this, or I should have been doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's quite an adventure. I going back through these layers, like I can see them. I very much had the sadness at the top. Then there was the anxiety and the fear.
Right.
Then I started going into the anger, and then below that, there's more sort of hurt right at the core. Sort of the core, like I'm bad. It's my fault. I'm not good enough. Right. And I called it because sort of an emotional archaeology. Is you can kind of go through these different layers of digging up, and it's like it's interesting because I have this mental narrative of what my life has been like, right? Which is, it's just a story. But actually, what's a kind of a truer story is what my body has been telling me as I've gone through this emotional archaeology. You go back through, and it's like, oh, this is what's actually kind of happened in my life in a more significant way. It's just the different programming my body is built up. It's like, as you said, it's not okay to express anger, and then feeling super anxious about. I remember writing emails was like terrifying. And there's all these different mechanisms that we build up. Beliefs about it's not okay to express anger. It's not okay to bother somebody. It's not okay to do this. It's not okay to do that. I need to be good. I need to be this. I need to be that. And in a way, you could almost see that as being our lives in a more meaningful way than some of the external circumstances, like this is my job title or whatever. Actually, what makes up the character of our lives is much more these layers that we've built up and sort of the beliefs around them. And in terms of relating that to addiction, again, that's where I would encourage people to look, rather than sort of focusing so much. External circumstances are very important for various reasons. You need to be in a safe external environment for the best chances of addiction recovery. But investigating, doing this emotional archaeology, what do I believe about myself and my emotions and so on? That's where the joy is at.
Right. Yeah, I think the more you can map out your own patterns and get clarity on that, the more it gives you kind of a jump board to work with the emotions. And again, the two need to be integrated for optimal results.
Yeah,
I think it's also interesting to see how culture kind of ties in with our addictions. Like take the UK where you're from, for example. There's that not expressing oneself is very common, right? Or do the right thing, or no, that's more Dutch. Be a good boy or girl. That's very English as well. So be polite, say sorry many times.
Yeah, but it's so funny. We see, well, it's like what's that quote that you see it on like the Facebook trauma things all the time about, culture, a sort of cultural personality or cultural stereotypes. They're kind of a trauma personified, because everyone knows perfectly well, yes, the English will say thank you and sorry and will cue better than anyone else in the world. But there's also so much, as soon as the doors close, they turn their backs. It's like, oh, I can't believe you did that. Can't believe, the anger, the resentment comes out because it has
in another way.
There's a facade of the politeness. And I noticed it. I mean, the famous stereotype from the war and things like that is the stiff upper lip, which is just maintaining resilience, but in a sort of unhealthy sense,
in a suppressed way.
Just in a very suppressed way, which again, that's a coping mechanism to, the history of Europe was fairly intense over the past 100 years. And so you could see those national traits as something, a kind of a coping mechanism that arises, but like all coping mechanism, it has downsides. And repression and suppression is one of the major issues, I think, of modern society that is completely unacknowledged. The fact that everyone is walking around suppressing all of their rage and their real feelings, and that creates, of course, a disconnect from yourself, a dissociation, like you said, because if you're not safe to express what you think and feel, then you have to dissociate from yourself in order to get through the day.
Right. Yeah.
And in fact, our society, you're talking about these cultural things, our society actually prefers us to remain dissociated, so that because we're then quieter, we then get on with our jobs and keep doing what we're supposed to be doing, more or less, which keeps things ticking along, rather than actually getting in touch with ourselves, which would be what would be best, I would say, for us in terms of our own authenticity and wholeness and such. I don't know what your thoughts are on the matter. It's really interesting.
Well, I think how would I phrase it? I think there's the implicit fear that once you start to address whatever's been suppressed for so long, that first you'll have a bit of an upheaval. I mean, you can see that on an individual level, that once you come out, you kind of start to work on your suppressed emotions, that there will be crises in your life, there will be some upheaval, and you probably have to take a step back from engaging in society or even with family and friends as you kind of move through those processes and work on yourself. So maybe on a society level, there's also that fear that when things really come out, it will first come out with a bang, right? It'll go from being suppressed as the pendulum swings to the opposite end, which is kind of large-scale conflict. And I think even the times that we're in right now is showing that to some extent, that there's a lot of things that are being suppressed, but there's also a lot of emotion coming out individually and collectively. And so that might also tie in with trauma, or these kind of patterns that kind of are suppressed for one generation and then pop up again in a different context. But the emotions, when they're not dealt with, they're going to come up in one way or the other, and they're going to express themselves. And I think it's then up to the individual to see, okay, do I want to work with that and work through it, or do I keep suppressing that? I think we've kind of moved a bit into kind of the intergenerational trauma and how deep trauma goes, but it's interesting to see how, I mean, for me, my work is all focused on trauma, and addiction is one layer or one part of that.
Yeah.
But I think we touched upon that briefly when we talked the other day, that there's also the mindset of addiction that is so deep within our psyche that, like substance addiction, we can easily recognize, like drink or drugs or medication or food. But then you get into behavioral addiction, I think they're a bit more hidden, like spending too much time on the internet, going from one video to the other, or whatever you're looking at. Then being glued to your mobile, it's the same thing. Like you go from your emails to your chat to whatever you're watching or engaged with. And music could also be a distraction. Excessive sports can even be an addiction. Compulsive behaviors are addiction. Excessive cleaning can be addiction. So everything can be turned into an addiction. And I think that there's also kind of a button in our brain that we constantly like to push, kind of the dopamine button, from hopping from one new thing to the other, that is at the core of addiction, that we're constantly trying to push that button to, again, avoid our emotional distress that we might be going through. And then, of course, the addiction becomes a habit and becomes an identity in itself.
Yeah.
But they're very different kind of angles or layers to addiction. And I can even see in my own life how I moved through different addictions. Like in my teens, I was smoking joints and using amphetamine and ecstasy. And then I moved from more into food and sex. And then And now whenever I get too stressed, I get into over organizing, or I'm quite a workaholic, quite habitually as well. So I just spend too much time working and trying to get things done, getting things off my list, that's also
Oh
a
yeah,
form of
I want to be
addiction.
I want to be a workaholic. I don't have that at all. I'm a total procrastinator.
Right. Mm.
Yeah, man. Oh, it's really, there's so much stuff to unpack in what you just said. I think, I mean, our society, there's a really interesting book called The Addictive Society by Anne Wilson Schaef. I think it was written about like 30, 40 years ago, but it's
Right.
still a really good read. And she talks about how the basic sort of structures of our society are fundamentally addictive in sort of the way that they operate. And she says there's two core addictions, which she describes as non-living and helplessness. The addiction to non-living and to helplessness, which, to just sort of interpret that a little, translate that a little bit, it's this kind of control is like at the core of our society. And of course, all humans want to be in control to some extent, but it's somehow been massively amplified because we feel helpless. So we have to have control over how we feel.
Yeah.
For example, that's that dopamine thing you were talking about. It's this like we constantly need to be controlling how we're feeling by every time we press a video, we're controlling how we're feeling. It's just like
Right.
bzz, you get the little buzz every time you go on Netflix and there's a new series. Bzz. And the non-living part is this kind of this dissociation from self, and they go well together, right? So you can sort of turn up the dial on your own personal dissociation machine at will. Because you can do it so easily. You have your phone, you have a little dissociation rectangle in your pocket the entire time. Anytime you want to dissociate a little bit, you just go, oh great. And so because people want these things in a kind of inauthentic way, it helps them cope from day to day. So in that sense, it's completely legitimate. Of course, all the companies then go, oh, great, well, we'll produce all the new stuff you want. That's totally fine by us. And in that sense, because it's so normalized, it's a really hard loop to get out of. It's really hard to even see, actually. Most people will probably think you're a bit crazy if you started, describing Netflix as, maybe not being, maybe being at least a double-edged sword. And it's tricky to step out of this stuff, just the constant screens and new videos and things.
Totally. Yeah.
And to find what it would mean to be living and authentic. Because that's actually, maybe I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. In that book, she makes a really interesting distinction between like how not to die and how to fully live. And she talks about how, and I noticed this as well, and some addiction recovery that focuses on being sober and abstinent is sort of how not to die. And that's super useful. Everyone wants to know how not to die, because you got to get some space in your life, find some new coping mechanisms for dealing with the suffering, and stop drinking, say, because it's killing you. But then it's a whole other ballgame to then move over to, okay, how can I get in touch with myself? How can I get back in touch with myself? How can I fully live and be authentic? And that's really, really hard actually in the world. That's sort of pushing the opposite.
I think we addressed that a little bit in the beginning, that you probably have to start with finding coping mechanisms before you can address the traumas. So, how not to die is addressing the addiction in such a way that your life becomes a little bit more manageable. So setting some boundaries of dealing with the addiction. And then once you have a bit more space and you can generate a bit more energy, you might actually start to address the emotions. And maybe they have to go in that order, or you go back and forth between the two, right? I mean, when I suggest people to deal with being activated or being triggered, and they can't contain a particular emotion, I suggest them to do something active. Could be cleaning up their kitchen or their house or their toilet, or going for a 10-minute walk each day, but at least to kind of release some of the stress so they can manage it better. And with addiction, I would say the same thing, how to kind of manage the addiction to such an extent, maybe after having to go to meetings like AA meetings or other meetings, to give some more containment to be able to deal with that stress. And then once you feel that you've hit the ceiling with that, is starting to address the trauma or the emotional issues, where you come into the field of starting to live rather than just managing not to die, right?
Yeah.
So, and then also what you mentioned a bit earlier is these kind of different character patterns that people have. So Some people might have a fight anger response of feeling helpless, and that's their sense of getting control. But then because it rests on a pain, it kind of goes overboard, and that fight anger response goes into too much controlling, or even narcissism, or abusing other people or situations, all for their own gratification, which can be an addictive pattern as well, to subjugate and control situations or people, or fault finding, all of that. So these kind of mindsets, they kind of create their own addictive patterns. And then a person that might deal with helplessness by moving into a flight, freeze, anxiety response, they might have a different set of addictions, perhaps, that relate to that mindset of being in flight, being in avoidance. And you might fall into more of a substance abuse rather than a behavioral addiction.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, different addictions are for different, so
characters.
depending on the nature of the underlying sort of trauma, if it's, as you say, more activated or more sort of shut down, different addictions are more helpful. Yeah. And yeah, for sure, I think it's really important. I do want to, we know we've covered a lot of sort of maybe more heady topics, but yeah, the practicalities of addiction in terms of how to approach it. I think, getting you'd call it getting your ducks in a row first is super important, of just maybe going to some meetings, having some support, some friends, so you can get a bit of a break from your primary substance or behavior. Because I changed so much with that. Just even stopping drinking, I felt my brain coming back online, because you get a bit, if you drink every day, you know, your brain's not
the best shape,
not on fire. And it's really helpful just to feel it heal. I remember I was walking along and my brain just went like ding one day. I was like, oh wow, I just got smarter. Holy crap, my brain just
I remember that because I smoked marijuana and hash for quite a few years at high school, and it took me a few years to actually feel that cloud lifted from the head, from the brain. It's kind of all these, the residue of these toxins, they take time to actually get out of your system. And it probably also helps to move away from people that are still indulging in that substance abuse. So you don't get triggered, or you don't get
it's a case of, it's almost like that first half is like managing your environment. So this when you're trying to give yourself space, you need to give yourself, your body and mind, what it needs, the emotional support, the right people, if it's possible, the right environment, so you're not in a relationship living with someone who's very difficult or using or something. Ideally, you know, you'd move out if that's possible. And then that's all dealing with the external environment in some way, shape or form. And then the switch towards the fully living is then to go, okay, it's not just the external environment, you know, that's a reflection also of my internal environment.
Right.
So let's have a little explore there as well. But
both,
you've got to do one then the other. Yeah.
I mean, my kind of last topic I wrote down on this paper in front of me is living with addiction, and also seeing that addiction is, again, it's a way of coping and managing a stressful situation. And so you'll fall back in and out of addiction repeatedly throughout your life. It's not something you can get rid of. But the moment you don't make a problem anymore out of it, you just you see yourself going into addiction, and your addictions over time will become less intense. So, for example, what I said myself, that I don't have any need for amphetamine or smoking a joint, but I might still from time to time fall into doing too much, like working too much or over-organizing too much. And then I know, if I recognize that, like, okay, where's that coming from? What's going on in my life? Can I take a step back and look at that? So you can actually use addiction as an alarm bell to point out something to you, like, okay, hold on, what's going on there? Do I need to take a step back, or what do I need to address? And stresses and triggers are going to be there in your life, either externally or internally. And I think the more you're able to work with those different layers, and you know also how to work through the emotional stuff, it makes it much more manageable, or much more able to deal just with life, you know.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I find that, you know, even some basic skills and being able to contain and process emotion is so useful, because you can, as you say, you can go, oh, I'm working loads. What's going on here? You just take a look and go, oh, there's this, there's this anxiety in the chest. I see. You can often, it's often, you can spot sort of what's that part of you that isn't relaxed, essentially, and then learn that the best way to approach it is to move towards it and see if you can open up to it, give it resource, whatever it needs, and integrate it. And how that ties into, you talked about sort of not getting so stressed about addiction itself. I find that what's super helpful for that is working with the shame that's associated with it. Because with addictions, particularly, if you've had a pretty intense one, or perhaps one of those people who has a lot of crazy stories, there's a lot of shame. And what was most helpful for me is going through that exact same process with shame. I would to bring it up, I would like almost imagine myself telling, I'd imagine like my family or my friends, like my boss or whatever, and imagine telling them about, what's going on, and imagine them to bring out that shame, and then just going into it directly. That's quite a direct way of approaching it. But as once I'd, had some practice at this work, but you can then just go into and feel all that shame, and help it process. And then it became so much easier to relax around my own remaining addictive behaviors once I'd had a good look at that shame. Then it just doesn't come up as much when you notice yourself, indulging in whatever it is.
I think it's a good point that you mentioned. Shame can be such a big thing for people, and again, you can get into a vicious circle. Like, you feel ashamed, you shouldn't be doing it, then you beat yourself up, and then you put yourself in such a thought spiral that you feel like you want to have a drink or drugs or whatever you need to kind of get away from the shame, because the shame is overwhelming.
It's a driver of addiction for sure. So that's why it's so unhelpful. A lot of people respond to addiction with shame. So you shouldn't be doing that. It just makes it worse. Adds more fuel to the fire.
Totally. Good. Okay, I think we covered quite a few things in just half an hour, 40 minutes that we've been talking.
Yeah, it's a whirlwind.
Good. Let's see if we can keep it here, and then maybe we want to follow it up with a second round, talking a bit more about addiction, or let's see where we can take it from here.
Yeah, maybe we could do something a little more practical. Let's see how people respond, maybe.
Good. Yeah.
But thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation, Roland.
Yeah, me too.
Thanks for having me on.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay, good. All right. Well, thanks for this chat, and we'll be in touch.